So we move on to the presentations for today. Alan Powell is going to be our first speaker. Alan is coming forward. Thank you, Alan. Alan has been involved in aviation for many, many years. Apart from club flying here, he towed gliders for an enormous number of years out of Cundon and other places. He has a deep and serious interest in aviation, and some years ago, he'll tell you all about this, he spotted a drover and fell in love with it. And he's been collecting information on the drover ever since. So we've got Alan to talk about the drover itself and its development, and then we have Harry O'Neill to follow because Harry flew one between Perth and Rottnest for a good period of time and got to know the aircraft very well. So it's over to Alan. Here you go, Alan.
That's a picture of the prototype Drover flying over Sydney Harbour. It's rather a nice view, I think, and more about that later. Now, as I said, I'm talking about the history, and Harry's going to talk about flying the thing. And this is a story of a love affair. I was over in, where was I? Oh, that's right, I was over in Adelaide. For some reason, way back in the late 70s, I went there for 3 years in a row, and of course, being a flying fanatic, I went out to Parafield. And there I saw this bedraggled aircraft sitting in the, on the grass, with the grass up to its wings in a most sorry state. And it was a Drover, and I fell in love with it. Unfortunately, this has not been reciprocated. It's unrequited love, because I've never flown in a Drover and never actually flown one. But I love them. So, the concept of the Drover, when I was over, saw this aircraft, it was flown by Covair, and they had a run between Yorktown and Kangaroo Island and Adelaide. And they had two Drovers, Echo Oscar Oscar, which was scrapped in about 1975, and the one I saw was Foxtrot Delta Uniform, which was a Mark III Drover, and it's still flying, and I'll tell you a bit more about that later. But the history of the Drover, well, they're the two aircraft. As I say, Foxtrot Delta Uniform still flies, the other one has been scrapped. Now, when the war finished, the de Havilland Company, and Major Murray Jones was the managing director, wanted the company to make aeroplanes, not just sell the British product. And during the war, de Havilland's had built tiger moths, dragons and mosquitoes, and they were phasing these out. And so Murray Jones got a team together of Martin Warner, and those in gliding will remember his name, Lou Gardner and Bill Downs, and they were the project team, given the brief to make or design a replacement for the Dragon. That's the story where they identified the need to replace the Dragon, and this is what they came up with: a 3-engine, 4-cylinder Gypsy Major engines with variable pitch propellers. And if you don't remember what a Dragon looks like, there we are. And during the war, de Havilland's made 87 of those in Bankstown, mainly because the engines in those were the same as the Tiger Moth, and they were being produced down at General Motors in Melbourne. You can see it's a pretty crude sort of aeroplane, but it flew, and some are still flying today, and you saw a picture of that brilliant one painted red which crashed a few months ago. So yep, they do fly. Now, the English company had produced the Dove in 1945, and that had a maximum takeoff weight of 8,500 pounds, retractable undercarriage, constant speed reversible pitch props, carry 8 to 10 passengers, over a range of about 900 nautical miles and cruised about 150 knots. And it was powered by two Gypsy Major or Gypsy Queen Series 70 engines of 380 horsepower. The Australian team wanted a less sophisticated aeroplane and fixed undercarriage, and design calculations showed them they needed three engines, 145 horsepower, and this was the Gypsy Major Series 10 Mark II engine, same as the Chipmunk. They were able to call on the parent company for technical information, and the Dove was a resin bonded system, and they decided not to go with that in Australia, so they just did ordinary riveting. The wing structure was similar to the Dove, but different because of the three engines instead of two. And the wingspan initially was going to be 58 feet, and they brought that back to 57 feet, the same as the Dove. And there's a cutaway drawing of the Drover to showing its structure, the three Gypsy engines. Notice the registration Alphazilla Sierra. More about that later, but that shows you what a Drover looked like in bits. Now, the prototype, when they got it going, they didn't have the brakes for it. So de Havilland's modified Dove brakes, which were run by compressed air, as it was only a temporary arrangement, they got a couple of mosquito oxygen bottles and used those temporarily to provide air for the braking system. When they got to manufacture, Dunlop's had introduced a hydraulic brake that was similar to the Chipmunk. In other words, you had a lever on the side which you pulled fully on, gave you both wheels braking, and if you pulled it partially on, you applied one on one side or the other and got directional control. Those of you who are flying chippies realise it's quite a complicated thing to get used to, but after 100 hours, it's pretty easy. The other thing they did on the prototype was they didn't have a hydraulic flap system, which they wanted. So initially, they got a cowl flap from a Beaufighter and used that for the flaps. But in the real aircraft, when they got production, they had a hand hydraulic pump and a selector valve for up, down, and you pumped like you did in the Beaver to get flaps. Now the first flight took place in the 23rd of January 1948, flown by Blackjack Walker, who's quite a famous flyer, and he was the chief test pilot for DH Australia. And they found that as it weighed a bit less than what they planned, it came out at 6,500 pounds instead of 7,000 pounds, their design sort of calculation, they had to move the wing engines about a foot forward for balance. Now that's the third Drover off the production line, Echo Bravo Quebec, but it's a beaut shot of the Drover showing the nose engines, showing the engines with the props, which were de Havilland variable pitch props. They talk about the Drover as being three chipmunks in close formation. I think you can understand what that means, but that's a beaut shot, it really is. Echo Bravo Quebec will feature in our story a bit later on. It pranked. Now, Qantas got some of the first production. They got 5 initially, and unfortunately, 2 of these suffered failure of the prop in service. And the first happened to Echo Bravo Quebec, this aircraft, in July 1951, when they lost the centre engine propeller over the Yuen Gulf in New Guinea, and it killed the pilot and the 6 passengers. The second incident that Qantas suffered was in September 1952, and the aircraft was taking off from Mackay. Fortunately, no one was killed. The aeroplane was quite severely damaged around the wings, and they were rebuilt. And when it came back flying, it was made into a Mark 1F model because they changed the propeller system on it. Also, if you can remember back, I won't flash it up, but the prototype one ended up flying for DCA up in New Guinea, and they also suffered an engine failure of the left-hand engine flying between Manus Island and the coast of New Guinea. The prop took out, I think, the throttle box, so the other 2 engines failed, and also the pilot suffered very severe injuries to his leg. But fortunately, they were able to ditch, and all the 3 people on board were saved. It was a real air-sea rescue thing. Now, because of this, in 1953, they decided to replace the manual pitch propellers of de Havilland, shown in that one, with what they've got on the Chipmunk, the Fairy Reed fixed pitch prop. And this was a successful modification, but the performance dropped off a bit for takeoff. So they produced high lift double slotted flaps, and aircraft that were modified like this became the Mark II version. There's a Mark 1F that currently flies with Haas. It's now a Mark II. You can see the prop's fixed pitch prop, and as I say, that still flies with the Haas, and I'll tell you a bit more about that later. There's a Mark II version, and you can see the double slotted flats hanging down as that's coming into approach somewhere. That one still is on the register. I have no information about it, but it was flying a few years ago. Oh yeah, in 1959, the Royal Flying Doctor Service was looking to replace its Drovers, and because of the capital cost involved, it became economical to replace the engines with Lycoming 0360 A1As and Hartsville constant speed propellers. And the first aircraft modified was number 5019 in September 1959, and it was handed back to the RFDS in June 1960. And these modified aircraft were called the Mark III. And there's a Mark III. That was one that Harry used to fly, and if you look close at the cockpit, I'm not too sure that that's not Harry waving to us. Might be, might not. But after Murchison had finished with the Drover, it was sold to this Air Rep Services Australia Proprietary Limited, WA, and they were flying around visiting stations, and they were salesmen with farming equipment and station equipment to sell. You can notice there's a circle around the tailplane. The Mark III just had the standard tailplane with no dihedral, but the modification with the extra engine power made the thing a little bit unstable, so they then modified the tailplane with a 14-degree dihedral. And there you can see that one's a Mark III, which is further modified with a maximum takeoff weight, but you can see the dihedral there of 14 degrees. And that one also is still on the register, and that was the one I saw, the one I fell in love with. As just to summarise, initially there were 20 production aircraft from 1948 to 1953. 2 went to DCA, and 1 was soon transferred to TAA. TAA had a total of 5. Qantas had 5. The Department of Health for the Northern Territory Aero Medical Services had 3. The New South Wales division of the RFDS had 3. Fiji Airways, which was associated Qantas company, had 2, which they use for as mini airliners, being island hoppers. And 1 was sold to a private owner, and that is 5020, which is now the Haas aircraft. Right, just to summarise the variants, Mark 1 was the original version with the Gypsy Major engine and the DH manual variable prop, and they built 14 of those. The Mark 1F, they changed it to Reed variable fixed propellers. The Mark II, because of the performance, they added double slotted flaps, and they converted 14 to Mark IIs. And Mark IIIs was the Lycoming engine Hartswood prop, and they converted 1 Mark I F and 6 from Mark IIs to that mark, and further modified them with the 3A, which had the 14-degree tailplane. There was 2 of those, and 1 3B, which had the 14-degree dihedral and a max takeoff weight to 6,800 pound. The Mark IIIs flew on with the Flying Doctor New South Wales section until 1967, and with the Queensland section they got rid of their last one in 1969. They then went to companies like Murchison, who flew them as mini airliners, and there are still 3 in Australia on the register today. But when I started thinking about this talk, there were 4 on the register, and I wrote to the owners asking information about number of hours, hours they flew last year, etc., etc. Now, I wrote to the owner of Alphazilla Sierra. It came back, because I sent it to its registered address, which was the accountant in suburban Melbourne. Came back, address unknown. So I looked up on the internet and found that the accountants were now situated in the Melbourne CBD, sent the letter off again, and again it came back, address unknown. And I could only surmise that Briar Hall Proprietary Limited no longer legally exist, and about a month later the aircraft Alphazilla Sierra was removed from the register, still leaving 3. There's Alphazilla Sierra in days when it belonged to TAA, flying around Queensland. Again, that's a Mark II version. Now, of the remaining 3, Alpha Delta November still exists, and it's owned by Bathurst Maintenance up in Bathurst, and they did not reply to my letter, but a couple of years ago they were advertising it on the internet, joy flights for $600 an hour, which would be about the operating cost of a Drover, I reckon. Yeah, nice shot. Right, Delta Hotel Mike. That's the one owned by Haas now. It's registered. It's owned by Boeing Australia, and it's operated by Haas. It's situated at the Illawarra Regional Airport at Wollongong, New South Wales. Last year it flew 22 hours and has a total airframe time of 3,240. That one, that is now owned by a chap called Ron Lee. It's in a museum sort of at Caboolture in Queensland. Unfortunately, it hasn't flown for a couple of years, but Ron is building a hangar for it and hopes to have it back flying in a couple of years' time. At the moment, it has flown 8,355 hours, and as I say, hasn't flown for the last couple of years, and that was the one I fell in love with at Parafield many years ago. Now, if I've inspired you to race out and buy a drover to refurbish to flying conditions, beware, because there are several airworthiness directives out. AD/DH3/25 details a centre section and wing spar-like limitation. This refers to a de Havilland document, which I haven't been able to trace, but it requires the replacement of all the wing spar bits in the fuselage. A very expensive job, I feel. And AD/DH3/21 requires an annual inspection of the wing and centre section spar booms for the presence of intercrystalline corrosion. And it requires you to strip the cockpit floor, the cabin floor, the leading edge between the fuselage and the engines, and you've got to remove all the paint and corrosive paint, or protective paint, and do an inspection. And then you've got other things to do if you find corrosion. A very expensive mod. So, in conclusion, was the Drover successful? Well, I don't think so. It only booked 20 from 1948 to 53, and most of those were sold to the Australian government or its agencies, DCA, Department of Health, Qantas and TAA. Qantas found the performance in New Guinea rather poor and soon replaced them with Beavers. And as they cruise, this is the Mark II at about 100 knots, consume 20 gallons an hour, use oil rated 2 quarts per hour per engine. They were fairly uneconomical. And from what I can see of the weight and balance for Foxtrot Delta Sierra, that's the one that Harry flies, or flew, they could take full passengers a few miles, like here to Rottnest and back, or you could take 2 people 500 nautical miles with auxiliary fuel tanks. They weren't a good load carrier, in my opinion. And with the Mark III version, that one, they increased the maximum takeoff weight to 6,800 pound from 6,500 pound. Well, that's an extra man and an extra woman of 40 years ago when we weighed a bit less. I'd like to read a poem that one of the pilots from Qantas, I think, in New Guinea when they had them, he would rather fly Drovers, so he named this one A Salute to a Tri-Motor. Though I'm only first the few, I'm sure that one will not do. I'd rather look over the nose of a drover. If one goes, I'm still left with 2. Just think of the wall, the wattat, the snake, and shove in Minyanya as well. I don't care 1 iota. I like a tri-motor. You can damn all your beavers to hell. When we were preparing this, Brian found this poem on the internet. It's not a poem, it's a grace. But it's rather beautiful, so I'd like to read that to you. Lord of the thunderhead and sky, who placed in man the will to fly, who taught his hand speed, skill and grace, to soar beyond man's dwelling place. You shared with him the eagle's view, the right to fly as eagles do, the right to call the clouds his home, and graceful through your heavens roam. May we assemble here tonight, and all who love the thrill of flight recall with twofold gratitude your gift of flight, your gift of food. And that was a grace sent by Father John McGilvray to the Royal Canadian Air Force 1995 Dunville reunion. It's quite a beautiful grace if you like that sort of thing.
There was a couple there that you mentioned that lost one engine. would it not fly at all on two, or would it not fly
Slowly down. But I think the props. Oops,
The props knocked out like that prototype one. It was a left-hand prop. The throttle box is up here next to the pilot. I think the prop would have come through, chopped that out so the throttles would have closed, and it chopped the pilot's leg rather badly. So he had no power, so down into the ocean, and they were saved, thank goodness. The other one, well, the centre engine failed, and what happened? They just went in. Who knows? I haven't read the accident report. It happened a long time ago. Thank you very much.